It begins in the hush that follows Christmas, when wrapping paper has been swept away and the house still holds the warmth of celebration. In Boulder, Colorado, the Ramsey home stood large and decorated, a picture of holiday normalcy. Lights dimmed, a tree that had been the center of attention only hours before, and the ordinary mess left by joy. Nothing in that quiet suggested how quickly ordinary life can shatter. That contrast is part of what grips this story from the first moment. A festive cocoon comfort, family, safety punctured without warning. Inside that house was a 6-year-old girl who had spent much of her short life on bright stages under stronger lights. JonBenet Ramsey was both a child and a symbol, a daughter who liked Christmas pageants and bows, yet also a familiar face in children's beauty contests, smiling in photos that would later circle the globe. To talk about her only as a case is to miss the human core. Before anything else, she was a child who was supposed to wake up to one more day of toys, family chatter, and leftovers. The empathy people feel when they look at her pictures comes from a simple recognition. A child's life stopped where it should have gone on. The morning after Christmas in 1996 began not with the routine noise of a house waking up, but with confusion that thickened into dread. There is something chilling about a home that suddenly feels unfamiliar to the people who know it best, rooms that were festive at night before now seeming to hold secrets no one can name. The Ramseys' movements that morning, the calls, the raised voices, the questions that begin with where and turn into how, formed a blur that investigators would later try to slow down, frame by frame. In every major case, there is a first moment when time seems to break. Here, it is a realization that something is terribly, irreversibly wrong inside one's own home. The community around them had gone to sleep under fresh snow, believing in the same ordinary safety that most suburban neighborhoods take for granted. Boulder in the 1990s was a place where locked doors sometimes felt optional and tragedy seemed like something that happened somewhere else. That illusion explains the collective shock that followed. This was not only the loss of one child, but the rupture of a belief that certain spaces, family homes, holiday mornings were beyond danger. When news began to spread, neighbors stepped into the cold not just to watch police activity, but because they needed to see for themselves how such a thing could be real. Officers arriving that day entered a scene that was already emotional and complicated. They faced an impossible balance, trying to be methodical while standing in the middle of the family's panic. The earliest hours of any investigation matter more than most people realize. They shape what can be known later. Every step, every open door, every instruction given becomes part of the record. Many listeners feel anger here not always at any single person, but at the fragility of process itself. When stress is high and fear is louder than protocol, small decisions can have long shadows. What happened in that house belonged not only to law enforcement, but to the swirl of human reactions, shock, denial, hope. The line between searching for answers and disturbing what might become evidence is easy to see in hindsight and nearly invisible in real time. Family friends came, officers moved. People try to help in all the ways people do when they believe a crisis might still be reversible. With distance, we can see the cost of those compassionate instincts. The scene was not the pristine snapshot investigators wished for. Yet it feels cruel to forget the context. These were people who believed a child might still be found safe. That tension between empathy and frustration sits at the heart of this case. The hours stretched. The house, with its many rooms and staircases, seemed to absorb the anxiety of everyone inside it. Outside, patrol cars idled and low radio chatter carried across the snow. Inside, clocks felt meaningless, but their hands continued to move, marking moments that would later be parsed in reports and interviews. There's a long, unbearable waiting before the full reality is acknowledged. Listeners instinctively imagine themselves in that space, walking through familiar hallways that suddenly feel like a maze of unanswered questions. At the center of everything was a little girl who could no longer speak for herself, and that fact gave the narrative its weight. Outrage comes from the mismatch between the vulnerability of a child and the complexity of the systems meant to protect her: procedure, media, public judgment. Even in the earliest hours, those systems began to activate. Reporters learned of activity at the house. The first fragment of information circulated partial, sometimes wrong, impossible to pull back once released. For the family, grief and scrutiny arrived together, an unbearable pairing. By the end of that day, nothing about life for anyone in that household resembled what it had been 24 hours earlier. Decorations remained, their brightness turning into reminders rather than celebrations. A house that had been a stage for holidays became a site of inquiry. People return to the story not only because of its unanswered legal questions, but because of its emotional dissonance, the way innocence and horror end up occupying the same rooms. It is difficult not to feel compassion for a lost child and anger that, in a place that should have been safest, something went so wrong. The opening chapter of the JonBenet Ramsey case is not only about facts or timelines. It is about atmosphere, about the moment when an ordinary morning cracks open and reveals a reality no one was prepared for. Everything that follows the documents, interviews, arguments, and theories will spiral outward from these first hours after Christmas. The case holds people because it forces a confrontation with uncomfortable questions about safety and truth. As we follow the timeline forward, the details that will soon emerge inside the home will deepen both the mystery and the emotion surrounding it. Before those details are examined, it is important to sit with the first reality. A child is gone, a family is broken, and a community has been pulled into a narrative it cannot put down. The silence of that winter morning seems to linger, not only in Boulder, but wherever this case is remembered. This is where the story starts, and why, years later, so many still lean in to hear what happened next. The next turn in the story arrives through handwriting on paper, an object at once ordinary and chilling. A ransom note found inside the Ramsey home transformed confusion into a structured message of threat. It was unusually long for such notes pages rather than a clipped demand and written in a tone that mixed theatrical menace with oddly personal phrasing. Investigators, journalists, and the public would later pore over every line, every misspelling, every shift in voice, searching for intention inside language. The very existence of such a carefully written note inside the home raised early, unavoidable questions. Who had the time to write this? When was it written? And why did it sound so strangely unlike the terse communications commonly associated with kidnappings? For the family, its effect was immediate and emotional. A note promising danger is not an abstract object when it names your child. It becomes a command that shapes every breath. In those first hours, before outcomes were known, there was still space for a desperate kind of hope that this would follow the familiar, if terrifying, path of a kidnapping where compliance could bring a child home. The note instructed, warned, staged an apparent narrative involving shadowy figures and dire consequences. It is here that empathy and anger converge. Empathy for parents confronted with words no one should ever have to read. Anger that someone used language as a tool to frighten and control. Law enforcement faced a parallel burden treating the note as both emotional lightning bolt and piece of evidence. The paper had to be studied, touched minimally, preserved, cataloged. Its length meant there was more to analyze. Choice of words, potential attempts to disguise handwriting, hints at familiarity with the household. Experts in linguistics and document examination would later be brought in, contrasting loops, pressure, slants, and spelling patterns. The note became not just a message, but a map that people hoped might lead to the writer. Yet the more it was examined, the more it seemed to complicate rather than clarify, offering many suggestions and few certainties. Inside the house, activity intensified. Rooms were searched again and again, stairs and doorways crossed repeatedly. There's a quiet tragedy in the idea that answers sometimes sit only a few steps away, unseen because no one yet knows where to look. The Ramsey home was large, filled with side rooms, turns, and a basement that was not a simple open space but a network of smaller areas. Basements already hold symbolic power in human imagination below ground, partially hidden, both part of the house and apart from daily life. In this case, the basement would become the emotional center of the investigation. When JonBenet was eventually found there, in the lower level of her own home, the narrative changed forever. The kidnapping frame collapsed in an instant, replaced by the hardest truth imaginable. Discovery brought no relief, only finality. This is the moment in the story where many listeners feel a surge of conflicting emotions, sorrow for a child who should have been safe, shocked that she'd been inside the home all along, and outrage at the idea that danger had been so close yet unseen. Investigators face the dual responsibility of compassion and procedure, aware that every movement near the body of a child is both an act of human care and a forensic decision. The basement itself now became a silent witness. Every object, every position, every trace needed to be interpreted carefully. Yet the earlier hours of movement through the home had already complicated the scene. Well-meaning people had walked, touched surfaces, opened doors, and interacted out of concern and confusion. Looking back, critics would emphasize procedural missteps. But in the moment, life was unfolding not as a training manual but as a crisis. That gap between ideal protocol and human reality is one reason this case remains so bitterly debated. No, Responsible telling of this story requires dwelling on graphic detail. It is enough to acknowledge that JonBenet had clearly suffered and that the basement marked the end of her life. The focus belongs on what those facts meant to investigators trying to reconstruct events, to a community struggling to understand how a child could meet such an end, and to a family plunged suddenly into both bereavement and suspicion. To stand in that basement, even imaginatively, is to confront a stark moral line. A child's life was stolen, and someone was responsible. In the hours and days that followed, the weight of the basement discovery pressed itself onto every subsequent decision. The ransom note, which once pointed outward toward unknown abductors, now had to be reinterpreted in light of the body being found at home. Was it a staged attempt to redirect investigators, or evidence of confused and interrupted plan, or something still more complex? Each possibility carried emotional consequences, especially because the potential circles of suspicion included both outsiders and those close to the child. That proximity of grief and accusation is part of what makes this case uniquely painful to follow. The public, learning fragments through news flashes, tried to assemble a coherent picture long before a full set of facts existed. Early reporting magnified small details, sometimes inaccurately, and those details spread quickly. The note became a subject of armchair analysis. The basement became a symbol. The house became less a family dwelling and more a national spectacle. For the people actually connected to the case, this attention felt like an additional storm layered over tragedy. Grieving in private is hard enough. Grieving while being watched, judged, and speculated about is almost unimaginable. Detectives and forensic teams worked to secure samples, document positions, and preserve what could still be preserved. They faced an uncomfortable truth. Some opportunities had already been lost. Even so, they persisted with the slow, painstaking effort of reconstruction timeline estimates, interviews, the tracing of movements before and after Christmas Day. Every hypothesis had to pass through the bottleneck of available evidence, which often refused to align neatly with any single narrative. This mismatch between human desire for clarity and the messy reality of facts is a defining feature of the case. For those hearing the story, the basement discovery marks the point where empathy deepens into something heavier. Listeners think of the last moments of a child's life, of a home that failed to protect, of the terrifying possibility that harm can come from unseen directions. Many also feel indignation, that anyone would harm a 6-year-old at all, and that the investigation's earliest flaws might have made truth harder to reach. These emotional reactions are not distractions from the case. They are part of why it has endured in public memory. It is not only a puzzle, it is a wound. As investigators moved forward, they carried two contradictory realities. There was now a body, but not yet an answer. The ransom note and the basement, taken together, formed a narrative no one could easily reconcile. That dissonance between a written story of kidnapping and the physical truth found downstairs became the engine of every later theory. Questions multiplied instead of narrowing. Was the writer the same person responsible for the crime? Was the note an afterthought or a plan? How could someone move within the home for long enough to write or leave such a message? The second phase of the JonBenet Ramsey case thus closes not with resolution, but with amplified mystery. What began as a kidnapping report had become a homicide investigation within a single home, involving a child beloved by many and surrounded by symbols of normal family life. The discovery in the basement and the existence of the ransom note would go on to anchor years of debate, expert disagreement, and public fascination. They are the twin pillars on which the rest of the story is built. The words on paper upstairs and the devastating truth downstairs, each refusing to fully explain the other. As the news spread beyond Boulder, the case stopped belonging only to one family or one police department. It became a national conversation, then an international one, reshaped with every headline. From this point on, the story of JonBenet Ramsey is no longer just about what happened inside a single home. It is about what happens when unspeakable tragedy collides with public opinion, media pressure, and the limitations of forensic certainty. The investigation did not unfold in silence. It unfolded under a spotlight, and that light sometimes illuminated and sometimes distorted. Almost immediately, suspicions began to divide along two powerful lines, the intruder theory and the family involvement theory. Each camp formed around selective readings of the same evidence, each driven by genuine desire for justice, but also by emotions, anger, empathy, fear, and the deeply human urge to find a story that makes sense. Listeners today still feel the pull of both directions. The idea of a stranger entering a home in the night is terrifying because it suggests randomness and vulnerability. The idea of harm from within a family is unbearable because it violates the place where safety is supposed to be absolute. Investigators face the task of working through these possibilities while dealing with procedural complications already baked into the case. Interviews had to unfold in the shadow of grief. Statements were parsed for hesitation, tone, inconsistencies. Every gesture shown on camera, every tear, every composure or lack of it was interpreted by millions who were watching from afar. The truth is that grief has no single correct expression, yet the public often expects one. The Ramseys found themselves judged not only on facts, but on demeanor, something that would follow them for years. The media environment of the late 1990s magnified everything. Talk shows, tabloids, breaking news crawls, and magazine covers transformed the investigation into ongoing entertainment for some and an emotional anchor for others. JonBenét's pageant photographs were printed again and again, sometimes without sensitivity to the fact that they showed a real child, not a character. This repetition created a cultural image larger than the person herself, and that imbalance fuels both empathy and discomfort. The audience mourned a child they had never met but felt they knew, which intensified anger that no clear answer merged. Within law enforcement, the case was complicated by jurisdictional tensions and disagreements about direction. Theories did not just divide the public. They sometimes divided professionals as well. Forensic evidence, while critical, did not provide a simple narrative. DNA findings were discussed, revised, debated, reconsidered. Some results pointed away, others seemed inconclusive or open to multiple interpretations. Listeners often feel frustration at this stage. In an era saturated with crime shows promising clear answers, this case refused to behave like television. It demanded tolerance for uncertainty that few were prepared to accept. As suspicions coalesced, reputations were shaped in real time. For the Ramsey family, grief was inseparable from defense. They were not only mourning their daughter, but also living within an atmosphere of scrutiny that seeped into every public appearance and private moment. Imagine trying to process loss while knowing that strangers around the world are arguing about your guilt or innocence. That double burden is difficult to overstate. Whether people believe in their culpability or their innocence, they were still human beings subjected to relentless speculation. Yet the intruder theory also held powerful emotional force. The possibility that someone had entered unnoticed, moved within the house, and vanished again forced the community to confront vulnerability that extended far beyond one address. It suggested that safety was porous, that evil did not always signal its arrival. Signs such as possible entry points, unexplained disturbances, and accounts of previous incidents in the wider area were examined through this lens. Each fact was like a shard of glass, sharp, reflective, but seldom forming a full picture on its own. With time, experts from many disciplines entered the conversation: forensic scientists, criminologists, behavioral analysts, handwriting examiners. Their opinions were sometimes aligned, often conflicting. Audiences following the case experienced swings in perspective driven by new documentaries, books, or televised specials that emphasized one interpretation over another. This case became a mirror reflecting the biases of whoever looked into it. Those predisposed to suspect families found signs confirming that belief, while those inclined to fear strangers saw evidence of intrusion everywhere. The emotional core remained constant. A 6-year-old child was gone. That fact anchored the outrage many people still feel. They are angry not only about the crime itself, but about the enduring uncertainty. Justice is not simply about punishment. It is also about clarity, about being able to name what happened. In the absence of resolution, families, communities, and even entire generations of viewers are left with open questions that refuse to fade. This lingering ambiguity is part of what keeps the case alive in public memory. The investigation moved through cycles: renewed testing, re-examinations, grand jury activity, public statements, and retractions. At multiple points, the narrative seemed close to breaking open, only to stall again. Leads went cold. Others proved misleading. Tips ranged from sincere to sensational. Detectives found themselves sorting not only evidence, but noise. For those following along, these shifts resembled emotional whiplash: hope followed by disappointment, certainty replaced by doubt. Each twist reignited debate, but none delivered finality. It is important to say what this section is not. It is not an accusation. Responsible storytelling about real cases avoids turning speculation into fact. Instead, it recognizes how suspicion itself changes people's lives. The Ramseys became symbols either of injustice suffered or guilt escaped, depending on who was speaking. That symbolic weight overshadowed their humanity in much of the public discourse. At the same time, advocates for the intruder theory felt unheard or dismissed by those convinced of family involvement. Pain existed on every side of the argument. For listeners, this phase of the case invites reflection on how society treats victims, families, and uncertainty. It asks whether our need for answers sometimes replaces patience for the slow pace of truth. It exposes how quickly narratives can harden, how rarely they soften again, and how digital echo chambers later amplify divisions initially formed in print and television. Behind every headline was still the image of a little girl in holiday lights and pageant crowns, a reminder that beyond the theories lies an irreparable loss. There's also a quieter emotional thread, compassion for investigators who knew that each misstep, each missed opportunity, each disagreement might echo for decades. They worked in the knowledge that the world was watching and that anything less than certainty would feel like failure. That pressure did not produce a neat conclusion. It produced fatigue, persistence, conflict, and occasional breakthroughs that did not quite break through far enough. By the end of this phase, the case had become something larger than itself, a cultural phenomenon, a recurring reference point in conversations about policing, media ethics, forensic science, and the fragility of public trust. Every re-examination promised closure. Every unanswered question reopened wounds. The suspicions that divided the narrative did not simply coexist, they shaped the trajectory of everything that followed. And so the story moves forward with two truths held at once: immense investigative effort and enduring uncertainty. People who encounter the case today often retrace these same forks in the road, feeling the same mix of sorrow and frustration. It is difficult to accept that such a high-profile case, with so much attention and so many resources, could remain unresolved. Yet, that is precisely what defines it. In the next and final part of this narrative arc, the focus turns to what came after: the years of debate, the advances in technology, the lingering questions of DNA, and the legacy left behind by a case that refuses to settle. For now, Section 3 closes on the uneasy middle ground where suspicion divides and empathy remains, where desire for justice endures even as the answers stay just out of reach. What remains after the cameras dim and headlines move on is often the most difficult part of any case, the long stretch of years in which absence becomes normal and questions harden into routine. The JonBenet Ramsey case entered this phase slowly, almost reluctantly, because it had never truly left public consciousness. It lingered in documentaries, news anniversaries, online forums, and family statements. The story lived on not because people enjoyed the mystery, but because a 6-year-old child had been lost without a clear accounting of why or how. Unfinished stories have a way of demanding attention. This one demanded it persistently. In those years that followed, science continued to evolve. Forensic techniques that seemed advanced in the late 1990s were eventually surpassed by newer forms of DNA analysis, touch DNA approaches, database comparisons, and more sophisticated interpretation methods. Each technological step forward brought renewed hope that what could not be resolved then might be resolved now. Items of evidence were revisited, samples retested, conclusions reconsidered. But technology alone cannot invent what is not preserved, and it cannot easily overcome the complications created on the earliest day of the investigation. Progress and limitation walk side by side. DNA, in particular, became a focal point of word repeated so often that it began to feel like a character of its own in the narrative. Findings were discussed in careful language: presence, absence, mixtures, partial profiles, possible transfer. For those outside the field, the desire was simple: answers in the form of a name. But science rarely speaks in absolutes. It speaks in probabilities and margins of error. Experts disagreed, sometimes publicly, about what the results meant. Over time, DNA evidence seemed to both narrow and widen the possibilities, clearing some paths while refusing to definitively light any single one. The legal landscape surrounding the case shifted as well. Grand jury activity, public statements, and subsequent clarifications added layers of complexity, rather than stripping them away. Some documents were sealed, then later unsealed. Interpretations changed as new information became available or as previous assumptions were challenged. The court of public opinion was rarely patient enough to mirror the caution of legal processes. Yet the legal standard proof beyond a reasonable doubt remained where it always had been, higher than public suspicion, firmer than rumor. Meeting that standard proved elusive. Across these years, the Ramsey family continued to live beneath the shadow of the crime and the scrutiny that followed it. Members of the family issued statements, participated in interviews, and sought to defend their names while also preserving the memory of their daughter. It is impossible to fully measure the emotional toll of that dual mission. Their grief was not something they could complete in private. It was constantly revisited in public forums, each new program or article reopening wounds. Whatever one's opinion about the competing theories, it is clear that the weight of the case did not fade for those most directly affected. The community of Boulder, too, carried a quieter legacy. The city's name became linked in the public mind with a single event, overshadowing the full reality of a place where people lived ordinary lives. For local law enforcement agencies, the case became a reference point for training, reform, and reflection. Procedures were re-examined, communication protocols strengthened, and the importance of early scene preservation emphasized again and again. The tragedy became an unintentional teacher, shaping how future cases would be handled in ways that JonBenet herself would never see. Culturally, the case helped define an era of true crime storytelling. It appeared in books, podcasts, documentaries, dramatizations, and online debates. Each retelling added perspective, but also risked repeating assumptions or cementing incomplete narratives. Responsible voices urged caution, reminding audiences that real people stood behind every scene reenactment or speculative discussion. Yet the fascination continued, powered by a mix of empathy for the victim, frustration over the lack of closure, and the human tendency to search for patterns in tragedy. This persistent attention says as much about society as it does about the case itself. Advances in investigative genealogy and database matching in more recent years sparked renewed hope. Other long cold cases were suddenly solved through combinations of archival DNA and family tree analysis, often decades after crimes occurred. Each success elsewhere led many to ask whether the same might one day happen here. That possibility remained suspended in the air, not promised, not impossible. Cold cases live in this tension between the weight of time and the unexpected breakthroughs that time sometimes allows. There's an ethical dimension to this final chapter as well. How do we speak about a child whose image has been used to sell magazines and attract viewers, without reducing her to an icon of tragedy? One answer is to remember that the core of the story is not confusion, scandal, or speculation. It is loss. JonBenet's life was short, but it was real holidays, routines, inside jokes, family moments that never made the news. To honor her is to resist turning her into a puzzle piece detached from her humanity. That recognition tempers both anger and curiosity, reminding us why answers matter in the first place. For listeners, the enduring uncertainty forces a difficult emotional posture, holding grief without resolution. We are accustomed to narratives that close, cases that are wrapped up by the final act. This one does not cooperate. Instead, it invites reflection on ambiguity and the limits of knowledge. It asks us to sit with uncomfortable possibilities and to accept that not every mystery yields to effort, even when the stakes are highest and the attention intense. That reality can feel intolerable, which is why calls for renewed investigation surface again and again. The phrase cold case sounds clinical, but it describes something profoundly human, the cooling of leads, not a memory. Investigators retire, new ones take their place, evidence boxes are reopened and relabeled, and the file remains thick. Somewhere in those pages are fragments of truth that do not yet fully align. Somewhere in the world is a person or persons who know more than they have ever said. That knowledge unspoken, unrecovered, or unproven constitutes the unresolved heart of the story. And yet, even without final answers, the case has already changed the landscape around it. It has influenced discussions about how police should interact with families, how media should portray child victims, how forensic science should be explained to the public, and how easily suspicion can become narrative in the absence of certainty. It has also reinforced a more timeless lesson, that justice delayed is not only a legal issue but a psychological one, lived daily by those closest to the loss. As the years stretch on, people sometimes ask whether closure is still possible. The honest response is that possibility remains. Cold cases have warmed before. Technology advances. Witnesses reconsider. Small details take on new meanings when viewed through later knowledge. The story is unfinished, which means it may still change. But even if future breakthroughs arrive, nothing will erase the central heartbreak. A young life ended in the place that should have been safest. So the legacy of the JonBenet Ramsey case is made of multiple layers: sorrow, mystery, outrage, compassion, and endurance. It lives in the determination of investigators who still revisit the file, in the voices of those who ask that the case not be forgotten, and in the quiet remembrance of a 6-year-old whose image traveled farther than she ever could. The snow of that Colorado winter has long since melted, the holiday lights taken down. The headlines are placed. What has not faded is a promise implicit in every investigation that truth matters, even when it is hard to find. Until the day clarity emerges, if it does, the story remains an open door in collective memory, inviting questions, demanding care, and reminding us of the fragile boundary between safety and loss. The cold case endures not as entertainment, but as a call for empathy and hope, however faint, for resolution. Above all, it endures because a child's name still deserves an answer